What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown. As always, enjoy this video. Please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of the discussion in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living in a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit-Down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting crime topic, and it's back to the world of the American Mafia. When we hear the name, the Gambino crime family, we think of John Gotti, Paul Castellano, and Carlo Gambino. But today, we are going to get into one of the most interesting people in the history of the Gambino crime family, a man whose life in crime lasted over 60 years. The story of Joe Piney Armone, next on Sit-Down Shorts. Joseph Armone was born September 13th, 1917. He would grow up on the Lower East Side in the neighborhood of East Village, just really to the east of Greenwich Village and just north of Little Italy. Now, Joe Armone, his family obviously emigrated from Italy, but he would have a brother almost 18 years his elder. His brother Stephen was born back in 1899 and was 18 years older than his brother Joey. Now, interestingly enough, as we know, whether you're in the mafia, crime, or really in generally a little brother follows his big brother and wants to be just like him. That was no different for Joe Armone, which we'll get into. The Armones would at one point live at 406 East 11th Street in East Village, and at one point they would also frequent and be inhabiting the area in and around 13th Street and 14th Street. At one point, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics would regard Stephen Armone as 14th Street Steve, and they would label him as a large-scale narcotics trafficker in the 30s. Now, for Stephen Armone, his business for the most part was heroin. Now, ultimately, he would begin to sell opium as well when he found that his connections into heroin weren't as fruitful. Now, for Stephen Armone, he would work under an individual, an old-school Gambino captain called Joe Biondo. Now, Joe Biondo in the 30s was a gigantic bootlegger. He, at one point in his youth, was very close with Charlie Lucky Luciano. And Biondo, upon the Volstead Act being repealed, he would get into not only the drug trade, but other high-ranking positions in the Gambino crime family. Biondo, remember that name, he would become very integral to a very interesting plot in the 50s. Now, for Stephen Armone, as I said, he would come up selling heroin through connects that he had in the old country, and he was able to bring heroin on cruise liners over from Italy. Now, at one point, though, Mr. Armone, the elder, would have trouble obtaining heroin. At that point, he would obtain opium from connections in California through Mexico and convert opium into heroin. So he was very much able to make with what he had and do what he had to do. Now, his brother, a young Joe Piney, who was really in his late teens in the 30s, wanted to follow in his brother's footsteps. And that was pretty easy because his brother was making a lot of money. Joe Piney Armone in the mid-30s, it was alleged he would gain his name, Joe Piney, allegedly after extorting Christmas tree vendors in and around the East Village and on the Lower East Side. So, Joe Piney Armone, remember, was born in 1917. By the mid-30s, he is in his teens still. In his early 20s, he's trying to get into the world of crime, and he did it very early. It wouldn't take long, though, for Joe Piney Armone. He would get right into the family business, also selling heroin. And he would become a very big heroin dealer himself as we get into the 40s and into the 50s. And by the 50s, he was a huge earner for people like Joe Biondo. Now, the Armones would hang out at a bar called Lulu's in the East Village on 2nd Avenue, and that would play a large part in the career of not only Stephen Armone, but also Joe Piney Armone. He would run most of his operations out of Lulu's bar as he jumped into the drug trade and down the road into the late years of his criminal connections. Now, as we know, in the 50s, it was the Mangano crime family, and we would probably be ventured to believe that Joe Piney Armone was made in the early to mid 50s, right? Same time that a lot of people were made, the Gambino crime family. We did a video on Andy Ruggiano seen here. He was allegedly made in that time as well. For Joe Piney, he and his brother Stephen would be called on to take part in a very interesting and choreographed shooting involving the boss of the family at the time, Albert Anastasia. As we know, there was a power grab being made in the late 50s in the Gambino family by Carlo Gambino. Now, there are a lot of questions as to who actually killed Albert Anastasia in 1957. A lot of people believe and are told it was Joey Gallo, it was Carmine Persico. I don't believe that. In fact, most historical researchers don't believe that either. In fact, it was likely Carlo Gambino asking his good friend Joe Biondo to find a shooting party to take out Mr. Anastasia. Now, keep in mind, witnesses at the Park Sheraton Hotel would identify the shooters as, quote, Italian looking and in their 40s. That would completely take Mr. Persico and Mr. Gallo out of this, because if you know anything about those individuals, they were in their 20s at that point. So they would be taken out of the lineup, in my opinion. Now, we would, through information, gather that Joe Biondo would go to his trusted confidant, Stephen Armone. Stephen Armone would call on two cronies of his, Stevie Coogan Grimalta, and an individual, a Jewish person called Arnold Whitty Wittenberg. Those are the two shooters of Albert Anastasia. Okay, that would play out in 1957. And as we know, and as seen here in a newspaper article, Anastasia would be slain inside the Park Sheraton Hotel, and the two that fired the weapons would shoot 10 times at Mr. Anastasia. So the Armones were taking on some very important pieces of business. Now, a lot of people don't know that originally Mr. Biondo went to Joe Piney. However, he was battling some charges in court and was unable to assist. And then Stephen got involved. Coogan Gramada got involved. Wittenberg got involved. Those are the people that took out Mr. Anastasia. Now, for Stephen Armone, he would actually die in 1960. And Joe Piney would take on the mantle of the Armone family. Now, I do want to say one other thing regarding the death of Albert Anastasia. A confidential informant report in the 60s would actually also identify Stephen Grimalta as one of the shooters in the Albert Anastasia hit. So that is something that I think is widely wondered about who killed Albert Anastasia. It wasn't Joey Gallo. It wasn't Carmine Persico. It was the Gambino crime family and their people taking out Albert Anastasia. Now, for Joe Piney, he would continue his criminal career. And by this point in the 60s, he is a made member in the Gambino crime family, and he is a large-scale drug trafficker. By this point, he is one of the most effective traffickers of drugs in the family and in the mafia. He would use his connections through different underlying connections that these families had, which we'll get into in just a second. Now, for Joe Piney, though, he would actually deal with some of his own problems. In 1964, Joe Piney would be shot 5 times at point-blank range at a place called Reno's Bar in the East Village. Now, Joe Piney would spend several months inside Columbus Hospital in New York City. The problem for Joe Piney is upon his recovery from being shot, the federal government would arrest him alongside about a dozen others in a case they would dub the French Connection case. Now, this is a newspaper article talking about the French Connection, but if you know anything about the French Connection, it basically connected the mafia to large-scale traffickers in Europe, and the feds would be led to believe that Joe Piney, alongside other members of the mafia, trafficked almost a metric ton of heroin worth in excess of $25 million into America. Now, keep in mind, This is $25 million in the mid 60s. Okay, think about the vast amount of money that is. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of heroin. This was an elite money making racket for the mafia, for people like Carmen Galante and John Armento and Joe Piney. All these people from different families, and they're all profiting off the mafia and off the drug dealing trade. Now, Joe Piney, as was customary, it was alleged that the mafia would use people involved in the transit of things as couriers. So think of it, whether it's airline pilots or sailors or things like that. Now, Joe Piney Armone would come up with a very interesting way to possibly beat the rap in this case, allegedly. It was alleged that in the mid 60s, upon the indictment of this and facing trial, Joe Piney Armone allegedly got the identification of a juror in this case. The juror would ultimately be approached. He was a shoe salesman. He would be approached by a buxom Playboy bunny called Patricia D'Alessandro. Very beautiful woman, ravishing. He would be approached, this juror, in his shoe store, allegedly offered $5,000 and other goodies. Now, the shoe store salesman was not spooked by this buxom woman. He would eventually go to the AUSA involved with this case, and Miss D'Alessandro would actually get 5 years in prison for bribery. So Joe Piney did absolutely try to get off in this case, but it wouldn't work. In 1965, Joe Piney Armone would be sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. It would be good, though, for him. He would learn more tools of the trade. And by the mid to late 70s, Joe Piney Armone was released after doing just about 10 years in federal prison. He would come out and a new boss would be installed. Paul Castellano had taken over the family. By 1977, it was very much well-known knowledge that Paul Castellano would make Joe Piney Armone a capo regime in the Gambino crime family. His hard work had paid off. He was a button man. He had made a lot of money, and now he was a skipper inside the family. And it's actually alleged that in 1977, Joe Piney Armone would actually sponsor Tommy Agro into the Gambino crime family alongside others. Joe Piney was seen in multiple surveillance shots with Mr. Agro, and he was a part of his crew at one point. Now, we would also find out a lot more about Joe Piney. It was not just drug dealing that he was involved with as well. He was also involved with different unions, and he was also involved with the music and entertainment business. According to a 1983 wiretap at the home of Paul Castellano, Joe Piney Armone would discuss a relationship with an individual in the Gambino crime family called Joseph Iskro. Now, Joseph Iskro was an individual that lived on the West Coast, and he was allegedly this record promoter that was making millions of dollars in the payola trade, if you know anything about the music industry. And he was essentially shaking down disc jockeys and other members of the musical groups and promotion teams of these acts. At one point on a wiretap regarding Mr. Iskro, Joe Piney Armone would tell Paul Castellano on that wiretap, quote, "That kid in California came to see me. He said they give him 50 to 100,000 to push a record. The company, they pay you just to make a record on the air. There's a lot that can be done out there," said Armone. Now, Mr. Iskro, throughout his criminal career, he is indeed a made member, allegedly, of the Gambino crime family, would refer to Joe Piney as Uncle Joe. Okay, there was a large-scale relationship between these two. So Joe Piney Armone was a very successful individual in multiple illegal fronts. He was making heaps and heaps of money and is one of the most underrated people in the history of this family that we don't talk about enough. Now, ultimately, as we know, John Gotti would find his way into this conversation. And in 1983, he would begin to put together a group of people that would take out the boss, Paul Castellano. Now, as important in all of these families, you need to get multiple levels of the family on board. The people connected to Mr. Gotti, they're going to be on board, right? but you got to get the old guys to get on board as well. And John Gotti was smart enough to know that he needed people like Stephen Armone or Joe Armone and Joanne Gallo to be on board with this. Now, at one point, according to the book Underboss by Sammy Gravano and Peter Maas, Sammy Gravano would detail how they ultimately found out that not only Joe Piney was on board, but that Joanne Gallo was okay with it. Now, remember, Joe Gallo was the consigliere for a long period of time. And John Gotti needed at least to get these guys to say, do what you got to do. He didn't want to just do it. You're not going to anger, and you don't want to anger the members of the old guard, the Jimmy Browns, the Joe Armones, people like that. Now, Joe Armone would essentially speak at one point for Joanne Gallo. At one point, Frankie DeCicco and John Gotti would speak to Joe Armone at the home of Joe Watts. Also at the conversation was Sammy Gravano. Now, in the conversation, Frankie DeCicco takes over the conversation to Joe Armone. At one point, he makes the comment, "John, let me do the talking now." He then says to Armone, quote, "We understand you have Joe Gallo." Armone responds, "Yes, I spoke to him. He won't be a part of this move, and his name can't be mentioned, but he will go along if we take over." So it's clear at this point, Joe Piney Armone is a part of the grouping that wants to take out Castellano. Now, Gravano would remember that DeCicco would stare at Joe Armone and say, quote, "What would we do if Gallo tips off Paul?" To which Armone would respond, quote, "If he betrays us or he backs up 1 inch, I'll kill him." So Joe Armone is essentially saying that if Joanne Gallo spills his guts to his old friend Paul Castellano about the fact that he's going to be killed, Joe Armone is saying he will take out his friend. This is Cosa Nostra right here. For anybody that has any fucking questions, this is Cosa Nostra right here. These are people that are willing to put their friendships aside for their, what they think is greater good. Very interesting conversation. And again, we can belittle John Gotti for his $1,000 suits and his ostentatious behaviors. However, he was very smart in understanding you can't just take out a boss without getting at least your family, the old guard, on board. And going to people like Joe Piney and getting even Joe Gallo to be in the fact of do what you got to do, getting Jimmy Brown on board, it was very important. This was a highly orchestrated hit, and it was done perfectly, if we're being honest. Now, for Joe Piney Armone, he was getting older, and upon the assassination of Paul Castellano, Joe Piney Armone would become John Gotti's new underboss in 1986 after the death of Frankie DeCicco. Joe Piney Armone, in his old age, would head down to Florida where he would kind of bask in the sun and take on his underboss duties, really as kind of an old guard member. Now, ultimately for Joe Piney, though, he would have some real problems of his own. And just because he was old didn't mean that he wasn't going to face the federal government again. In December of 1987, Joe Piney Armone would be convicted in Brooklyn federal court of charges involving racketeering, extortion, and bribery. According to the bribery charge, this would have to deal with an early 80s a bribe to an official to transfer the son of Joanne Gallo out of a state prison system to a federal prison system. Allegedly, the government believed that Joe Piney was behind a bribe, and he would ultimately have to pay for this and go to prison. Upon his conviction, Joe Armone would ask a federal judge if he could spend Christmas with his wife, guaranteeing that he would return to court after his sentence. Now, the judge initially in this case, guys, would approve the temporary release. He would only approve the release, though, if Armone swore that he would renounce his membership in the mafia and neither speak or be seen with fellow mafioso. Now, in the true Joe Armone fashion, he politely declined the request. and was sentenced to over a decade in federal prison. Joe Piney Armone would actually die in February of 1992 in federal prison. He was 74 years old. Now, we would see Joe Piney Armone portrayed on the big screen in the terrific, one of the best mob films ever made, the HBO version of Gotti, starring Armand Assante, and Sopranos actor Dominic Chianese would play Joe Piney Armone. In my estimation, he did a pretty good job if you've watched the film. Joe Piney Armone is very interesting. I've always felt like in my research, he is one of those interesting people this family ever saw, the Gambinos. He made a ton of money. He was very powerful, had a lot of people under him, and really lived the mafia life until the end. He was one of the old guys that we just don't see anymore in this life. And people like him, as I said, kept the wheels of this family turning. They created new members. They took on important hits. They stayed in line, made a lot of money, and did what they had to do when the going got tough. Joe Piney Armone was a pioneer in the Gambino family, and they just don't make them like him in the mob anymore. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe so you never miss another sit-down video. If you want more great crime content, check out my podcast, The Sit Down. The link is in the description below. We'll see you next time here on The Sit Down.